this weekly English news bulletin on Ronahi. A delegation of Kurdish politicians visited on 7th of December the Kurdish leader Öcalan on İmralı Island. The Kurdish leader emphasized during the visit on the need of the Turkish government to take steps in order to proceed the peace process. The Kurdish leader extended his condolences to the Kurds and the families of the Gever demonstrators who lost their lives in a police attack while protesting against the ongoing attacks on the cemetery of People Defense Forces. The Kurdish leader described these murders as an extreme provocations to the peace process and said that everyone must be aware of bigger provocations. The best way to commemorate Gever martyrs is to perpetuate their names in the struggle for peace and freedom. The Kurdish leader Öcalan added, "While I keep my faith in the process, I expect the government to take more positive initiatives on negotiations. Whoever delays democratic steps for the sake of election purposes will create chaos and jeopardize the peace process that will lead to the liberation of Turkey and the region and the establishment of a true democratic republic." In order to develop this phase of the peace process, the Kurdish leader suggested the followings. Firstly, a legal basis and judicial framework should be applied for the process. Secondly, since negotiations without an independent party is not possible, the status of the negotiated parties need to be defined within the legal framework proposed. And thirdly, an extensive management or tribunal should be formed to follow up the process. The Kurdish leader Öcalan added, "In order to implement my initiatives and to carry out my responsibilities toward the peace process, media and communication facilities should be provided to me. In this way, I will be able to convey my thoughts on the peace process and on establishing a democratic Turkish Republic to the Turks and Kurds." In an interview with the American Foreign Policy, the co-president of Kurdistan Communities Union, Jamil Baik, accused Turkey from starting the peace process in Turkey and northern Kurdistan and moving the war against the Kurds to Rojava. In his interview with journalist Jace Winter for the American magazine The Foreign Policy, Baik said both the PKK and AK party agreed to let the guns fall silent and politics speak, adding that the AK party, however, hasn't lived up to this. "We are continuing the ceasefire, but if the government insists on its current policies, then we will revise our stance." Baik accused Turkey of using the peace process to support jihadist groups against Rojava. "We didn't start the peace process so that Turkey could move the war to Rojava by supporting the al-Nusra Front, the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham, and other groups." Baik denied in his interview with the Foreign Policy magazine the charges, arguing that the PYD has chosen a third way that doesn't take sides. Baik said in this regard, "Syria doesn't have the power to control all areas. It is good they are not attacking the Kurds. Do we have to be bombed by Assad to prove that the PYD doesn't have relations with the regime?" About Turkey's relations with the regional government of Kurdistan, Baik said, "We are not against economic, political and diplomatic relations between Turkey and South Kurdistan. This is normal since they are neighbors. We find this to be positive," Baik said. "What we oppose are relations that have been developed against the PKK. Barzani is taking up Turkish policies," Baik said, accusing Barzani of losing his honor and becoming the lifesaver of Erdogan's failures. The Kurdish leader Öcalan sent a condolence letter and a wreath to the funeral of Nelson Mandela following his death on December 5th at age of 95. Öcalan described Mandela in his condolence letter as a shining star that enlightened the people of Africa. The Kurdish leader said in his memorial letter that the tears that are being shed for Nelson Mandela today, the stories that are being shared about him, and the wisdom that he bequeathed to all other freedom movements shows us what an outstanding individual he was. Mandela and the struggle for democracy and freedom that he pioneered are the very basis of what defines the concept of struggle for those who have adopted the principle of free and equal life. Mandela, through his wise, joyful and courageous attitude, accomplished to remain full of hope even in the most difficult times of imprisonment. He completed his struggle, this political period that became his life, as a free human respected by the whole world and as a source of inspiration. The prison bars are cold and rusty, like the hearts of those who are cowardly enough to put courageous humans behind bars. But the great legacy that Mandela left to all of us is never to surrender, not in prison, not even in the most difficult moments. He was a shining star that enlightened the people of Africa. We are determined to have that star shine on the people of the Middle East. We hope that we all will live and die as free citizens in free countries, in honor and peace, just like Nelson Mandela. Mrs. Haveen Gunashar, the spokesperson of the International Initiative Freedom for Ojalan and Peace in Kurdistan, will join us now live from Johannesburg to update us with the latest. Mrs. Gunashar, thank you for being with us. After the members of the African National Congress have paid their final tributes to Nelson Mandela, his coffin is now in his way to Kunu, Mandela's hometown. Update us, please, with the latest, Mrs. Gunashar.
Yes, thank you. I'm just trying to get to a quieter place, but let me tell you that it has been an enormous week, really. It hasn't just been a week to tribute Nelson Mandela, but also it is a tribute to the revolution in general, actually. One could say that the ceremony that was organized by the ANC today at the Waterkloof Air Base was actually a tribute to all the martyrs. One could see that one by one, when all the parties, starting from the Communist Party of South Africa, KOCER, and others, as they walked to the stage, everybody just started singing revolutionary songs, and they once again remembered their martyrs, as well as Mr. Mandela, and especially in his personage. Actually, at the time, a poem was read, a poem which recited, in fact, many martyred people's names. So it was quite an emotional setting today. And at the same time, of course, we were there as a delegation. On the 10th of December, we arrived as a delegation of about 4 or 5 people. 2 were from the Democracy and Peace Party, BDP. One was the co-president of the KNK, Kurdistan National Congress, and I myself. And later, the next day, the 2 from the BDP left to return back to Turkey, and we remained here. And I must say, as you were also saying during the news, Mr. Öcalan had, the Kurdish people's leader, had sent a message, a special message to Mandela, and also he wished that flowers be in his place laid to him, and this is what we tried to do here, actually, and what we managed to do was to be able to deliver, actually, the flowers in person to Mr. Mandela's house in Johannesburg, where his grandson, Dumani Mandela, received them from us. And we were invited into the house, and we were asked to sign the memorial book, and also asked to join them, where we also met Garza as well, Mr. Mandela's latest wife. And so it was really a scene to see, because there was such a huge international gathering as well throughout these days.
Mrs. Haveen Gunashar, the spokesperson. Yeah, go ahead, Mrs. Haveen.
Yes, and also at today's memorial, it wasn't just the heads of states that were mentioned. It was also movements, like the Irish peace process, those who took part in them, Sinn Féin, and also the Kurdish delegation were also called out. The KNK was called out. The BDP was called out, and they were thanked for being there and it being there in solidarity. And now we've left the Waterkloof Air Base. Mr. Mandela's body has also been given a memorial, and it has been put on a aeroplane, and it has been sent to his village, Kunu. And at the moment, actually, we are also on our way there.
Yeah.
I am the last member of the delegation here, and I will be traveling to Kunu today to be present in tomorrow's state memorial service.
Mrs. Savin Gunashar, the spokesperson of International Initiative Freedom for Öcalan and Peace in Kurdistan, thank you very much for the update. Both Nelson Mandela and Öcalan, the freedom fighters, are sharing similarities in their struggle freeing their people. The two leaders jailed in isolation called from their prisons for dialogue and peace. To the Kurds, Nelson Mandela was a source of inspiration for their own struggle, a freedom fighter who was jailed in isolation like their own leader. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison, fighting against apartheid in South Africa. Initially on Robben Island and later on Pollsmoor Prison and Victor Verster Prison. 20 years ago, on 11 of February 1990, Mandela was released from prison as he was the key to the peace and democracy in South Africa. Demanding the release of Mandela and other political prisoners was a precondition to negotiations. While imprisoned on İmralı Island, the Kurdish leader Öcalan continued to spend the past 13 years rebelling against the Turkish state brutality, state-sanctioned discrimination, and inherently racist laws toward the Kurdish people. Öcalan, similar to Nelson Mandela, has renounced violence, continuously called for dialogue and peace between the Kurdish people and the Turkish state. In their struggle, Öcalan has been instrumental in the struggle for the rights of the Kurdish people, in the same way as Nelson Mandela was in the fight for the rights of the South Africa people. On 6 of September 1997, at the Kurdish festival in Germany, Nelson Mandela sent a message to the Kurdish people in which he said, "I'm a part of the Kurdish struggle, I am one of you."
We know what it means to be oppressed in our own country. We know what it means to be insulted in our own country. We know the pain of a mother whose children disappear. We know what it means for a child not to be taught in the language of his or her mother. We know what it means to have one's nationality and culture insulted. This is what the government of Turkey is doing to the Kurds. It is for this reason that I am not your visitor. I am not your guest. I am part of the Kurdish struggle. I am one of you. We know that the European community, and particularly Germany, use the excuse of terrorism and state security to stop a peace process. I want to tell them that President Nelson Mandela was also called a terrorist. Today is the president of South Africa. I want to tell them that Robert Mugabe was called a terrorist. Today is the president of Zimbabwe. President Samuel Joma was called a terrorist. Today is the president of Namibia. My dearest friends and comrades, we hope that very soon that your leaders will be in your parliament in Kurdistan, and you will have your own president. Our proposal to the world is very simple. If we want peace, then we must talk to the leaders of the Kurds. The war waged by Turkey is not only against PKK, it is also against human rights in Turkey. It is also a war against the masses, the workers, and the labor movements. And it's a war against democracy in Turkey. Terrorism is used as an excuse to deny the human rights of the Kurds and also the people of Turkey. When I look at this gathering here, then I know that we sing and we dance. But like us before, I know that deep down in your heart, You have a desire to be free and to have self-determination. This dancing and singing here is your expression for a desire for your motherland. You do not want to be spread all over the world. You want to be in Kurdistan. Comrades, friends, the peace trade was stopped. But if I look at you here, I am convinced that nobody will be able to stop the determination of the Kurdish people to be free. Biji Sirok ANC. Biji Sirok Apo. Spas.
The co-chair of People's Democratic Party, Ertuğrul KURKCU, spoke to Ronahi about Nelson Mandela's death and how Kurd centers can learn from his legacy.
Mandela meant a lot for the Kurdish people in Turkey in the sense that he brought together the use of every kind of struggle, every method of struggle to reach a very clear target, that is peace and reconciliation. I think Mandela's example is unique in the sense that he has used this peace and reconciliation mechanism instead of vengeance, and has brought about a new, multicolored, multifaceted, multi-ethnic, multicultural society, and which could not be brought only through force, but which needed peace and reconciliation. In terms of Kurdish struggle, Nelson Mandela presents the example that if you have a legitimate cause, there is no harm in making every kind of concession to make your people, to make your country strong and liberated. So this is one of the methods that Kurdish people can take as an example. Not only the Kurdish people, looking at the present situation in Turkey, also the Turkish government, Turkish people has a lot to learn from Mandela.
To shed more light on how Kurds can learn from Mandela's legacy, the journalist and historian, Mr. Nicholas Browns, will join us now live from Berlin. We are pleased to have you, Mr. Browns, on Ronahi. Nelson Mandela was a supporter of the Kurdish freedom struggle under the leadership of Öcalan. This Kurdish struggle, which has been compared to the South African struggle under the leadership of Mandela. How can the Kurdish people benefit more from Mandela's experience to achieve their freedom, in your opinion?
Hello and bonjour.
Bonjour.
I think the Russian system of apartheid was abandoned for three reasons. One was the struggle of the people, the leadership, could it also very
It seems we have a technical problem. We apologize, and let's continue our bulletin. We will go back to Mr. Browns later in the course of this bulletin. The Islamic State of Iraq and Ashram is continuing its operation against Kurds living in Rojava and Syria. Recently, the group has kidnapped 170 civilians from the village of Ahras after kidnapping dozens in Jarablus and Manbij. The Islamic State of Iraq and Ashram kidnapped 170 Kurdish civilians from the village of Ahras near the town of Azaz in AFRIN district. After kidnapping more than 50 Kurdish civilians from the town of Manbij, located 80 kilometers from Aleppo city, and kidnapping dozens of civilians from the town of Jarablus, among them children and women. While in Aleppo city, the Islamic State has taken with force the homes of Kurds in Ba'abdin neighborhood and turned it to their bases. In Al-Jundi village of KURKCU, members of the Islamic State attacked the People Defense Unit's checkpoint. As a result, 3 YPG fighters lost their lives and 4 attackers who fled to the nearby villages have been captured by YPG fighters. Tel Abyad city, located 100 kilometers from Raqqa city, is witnessing sporadic clashes between People Defense Unit fighters and the Islamic State. The clashes centered at the west of Tel Abyad resulted in killing of an emir of the Islamic State. While in Raqqa, which is completely under the control of the Islamic State, Ahmed Ali, a 60-year-old Kurd and member of the Peace and Reconciliation Committee in the city, was tortured to death after 3 months of being captured. On the other hand, in KOBANE region, the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham attacked the village of Jebel Faraj and killed 1 civilian. The acts of the Islamic State against Kurds prompted the youth of KOBANE to march in the city. The youth demanded the Islamic State to stop their deliberate attacks on Kurds, which according to them is aimed to clean Syria and Rojava from Kurds. The Islamic State of Iraq and Sham, the Sunni jihadist group which was formed in April 2013, is aiming to build an Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, including the Kurdish areas. The roots of the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham go back to October 15, 2006, when what is known the Islamic State of Iraq was established from jihadist groups of Sunni fighters.
هذا ونحن بحول الله وقوته نفرض سيطرتنا على الكثير من المناطق التي تساوي في مساحتها دولة المدينة الأولى، وليس للأعداء فيها حظ ولا نصيب، والمجاهدون يقيمون حدود الشرع والدين فيها وبطلب وإلحاح من أهل السنة أنفسهم. وليعلموا أن بغداد الرشيد دار الخلافة بناها أجدادنا، ولن تخرج من أيدينا إلا على أشلائنا وجماجمنا، ولسوف نعيد غرس راية التوحيد، راية دولة الإسلام فيها من جديد.
The Islamic State of Iraq, which rose to prominence in the ashes of the United States-led invasion to oust Saddam Hussein. Since the complete withdrawal of United States forces in late 2011, the Islamic State of Iraq has accelerated the pace of attacks on mainly Shiite targets in what analysts say is an attempt to reignite conflict between Iraqi Sunni minority and the Shiite-led government of Noor al-Maliki. Meanwhile, the militant group has expanded its reach into neighboring Syria, rebranding itself as the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham. When the group was formed in April 2013, it was initially presented as a merger between the Islamic State of Iraq and the Syrian jihadist rebel group, the Al-Nusra Front. However, the announcement of the merger by the Islamic State of Iraq leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was immediately rejected by the Al-Nusra Front. The Islamic State of Iraq and Sham has since become one of the main jihadist groups fighting opposition fighters and controlling liberated areas rather than the Syrian government forces to establish an Islamic State from Iraqi Diyala to Beirut, Lebanon. The precise size of the Islamic State is unknown, but it's thought to include thousands of fighters, including many foreign jihadists who are controlling Raqqa, Jarablus, Minbij, Al-Bab, Azaz, North Idlib, and part of Deir ez-Zor. In their controlled areas, the Islamic State bans smoking, forces women to wear the veil, and carries out brutal public executions. While violations against civil activists has become daily news associated with the Islamic State, as well as its daily attacks targeting different military forces fighting against Assad. In many cases, activists have been forced to leave Syria because the Islamic State is widely unforgiving to anything different from their own point of view. These acts raise suspicions that the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham is an organization directed by the Syrian and Iranian intelligence that Assad's regime attempts to penetrate the revolutionary forces to defame and beat them. In order to gain the control over Rojava, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Sham is targeting the people of Rojava with the financial and logistical support of Turkey. In July, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Sham became for the first time involved in attacks against Rojava. Alongside with other groups, the Islamic State attacked the town of Serikaniye. Their fierce attacks are continuing on Rojava, and the group became the most prominent one, attacking the Kurdish areas. After several defeats in their battles with YPG and TPG fighters to take over Rojava, the group resorted to other tactics like abducting civilians, committing massacres, carrying out suicide attacks, and imposing embargoes. In July 2013, two Kurdish towns of Tel Aran and Tel Hasl have been under brutal attacks of the Islamic State of Iraq and the Sham. The organization massacred 40 innocent Kurdish children, women, and elderly people, while 2 young men have been beheaded and Kurdish homes have been looted and destroyed. Moreover, 250 civilians were abducted, while thousands forcibly fled. On the other hand, the Islamic State, alongside with other armed groups, are continuing their tightened siege on AFRIN and KOBANE regions. For more than 6 months, the two Rojava regions, which embrace thousands of refugees, are isolated from their surroundings. On the 1st of December, the Islamic State circulated a memo on Afrin surroundings in which instructions were given to tighten the siege on Afrin and mentioned, in case of violating the instructions, the person will be referred to the so-called Islamic courts. In all these acts carried out by the Islamic State, Turkey played a key role. Turkey supported the group financially and logistically in order to foil the Kurdish movement and to prevent the creation of any Kurdish entity. In this regard, BBC's correspondent Richard Kalpen reported from Turkey how foreign fighters of the Islamic State of Iraq and the Sham are using safe houses in Turkey to cross into Syria.
The hills of northern Syria. In the region just beyond here, the revolution is being turned into a jihad or holy war led by foreign extremists. This group, called the Islamic State of Iraq and Greater Syria, or ISIS, is behind this change. More extreme than Al-Qaeda, it's called on Muslims worldwide to join the Syrian jihad. I met a jihadist from France who's been fighting alongside ISIS. He rejects some of the extreme methods of ISIS, but shares their goal of an Islamic State in Syria for Sunni Muslims only, not for the minority Shia community.
It is very, very important to fight in Syria. It has more significance for Muslims than any other land on earth, apart from Mecca. And it is definitely a fight against the Shia. They are not part of our religion.
This is one of the busy border crossing points here in southern Turkey that many jihadists use to reach Syria after travelling down from Istanbul, an increasingly organised route. What we've discovered here in this town, as in others along the border with Syria, is that there's a network of safe houses for foreign jihadists, where they can remain out of the sight of the Turkish authorities before they cross into Syria. There are even some safe houses which are exclusively for British jihadists. It was too dangerous to film the safe house we went to see, but the man who runs it agreed to come into our vehicle and be interviewed.
I think more than 150 people stayed at the house over the past 3 months. Between 15 and 20 were British. They stay for a day or two before crossing into Syria.
Most are joining the extremist group ISIS, which now controls several towns in northwest Syria. It's also targeting the people who started the revolution. Here, a local commander of the original armed opposition, the Free Syrian Army, is executed along with his men. A former member of the FSA, now in exile in Turkey, told me he was lucky to survive when his unit was captured by the foreign jihadists, who said they were not true Muslims.
I saw how they beat my friends with iron bars, smashed their faces with ammunition boxes, and then killed them. We made the revolution for freedom and equality, but the jihadists don't want this. They've come to destroy Syria.
Like many other Syrian activists in exile here, he now fears the revolution and even his country could now be lost to the jihadists. Richard Galpin, BBC News, in southern Turkey.
Let's go back now to Mr. Nicholas Browns, the journalist and historian who will join us now from Berlin. Welcome again, Mr. Browns, to our show. Let's start with the Mandela struggle for freedom. How can the Kurdish people benefit more from Mandela's experience to achieve their freedom, Mr. Browns?
Hello. Well, abandoning the racist apartheid system was possible because there was a combination of several struggles. First, there was a powerful struggle of the oppressed people under the leadership of the African National Congress and the Communist Party. But then there was also the defeat of the South African army in Angola, fighting against internationalists from socialist Cuba. And then there was a third, maybe most important reason, there was an international campaign to boycott South Africa, because at this time leading countries of the international community came to the conclusion that abandoning the apartheid system would serve stability and economical development in the region. Well, and if we look to Kurdistan, we see the democratic mass struggle, we see the armed guerrilla struggle, but there is not enough pressure on Turkey or on the Arab states at the moment. So this makes it difficult to find a solution to the Kurdish question. Well, and what we can learn from South Africa, from Mandela as well, is maybe how the Kurdish people should not act. Also, Mandela did a great democratic struggle, but he was able to end apartheid system in law. But now there is still a kind of social apartheid. The majority of the people in South Africa, they are black and poor. Minority is rich and white. And I think for the Kurdish people, this shows the importance to connect the national democratic struggle with the struggle for social liberation, or as leader Abdullah Öcalan calls it, a struggle for a democratic alternative against capitalist modernity. And therefore, the struggle of the Kurdish people under the leadership of APO is a much greater struggle even than the struggle of Mandela, because it's a struggle, yes, not only against national oppression, but it's a struggle for a new democratic system.
Before discussing the latest developments in Rojava, let me ask you about your latest October visit to Rojava. What was your impression on what the situation looks like in Rojava, Mr. Browns?
Well, since the beginning of Rojava revolution, I am writing about it, but I was dependent on reports by others, by my Kurdish friends, news agencies and papers, and therefore I wanted to see with my own eyes what's going on there. And I was really impressed, because in Rojava it is a real revolution. I've seen the people liberating themselves, getting organized in democratic people's councils, governing themselves and to control their own economy. And really, everywhere you can feel this revolutionary spirit. You see the people, young people, old people, and especially the women supporting their liberation. Yes, I was especially impressed with the leading role of the women, not only in the armed groups, in YPG and Asayish, but also the leadership of the party in the People's Councils and everywhere. It is a revolution of women. I think this is a unique situation all around the Middle East. In fact, I had the feeling that the Rojava revolution could create an alternative not only for the Kurdish people and the other nationalities living there, but it could be an alternative for future democratic Syria and for the whole Middle East.
The developments in Syria and the region opened new chances for Kurds to obtain their rights and create an entity in Syria. How did the Kurds till now make use of this opportunity, in your opinion?
Well, I think it was a really far-sighted decision for the Kurds in Rojava under the leadership of PYD, neither to take side with the Baath regime nor with the nationalist opposition. Taking a strategy of a third way, this was the correct thing, and therefore the Kurds in Syria, in Rojava, they were able, in the shadow of the civil war, to gain huge advantages, to control great parts of Rojava for building a new, free society. But I think, no, Rojava needs international solidarity and support. It needs especially the support of the Kurds outside Rojava and the other countries. But there I see problems because the government in South Kurdish region under President Barzani takes at the moment a very bad stance towards the Rojava revolution. In fact, Barzani sides with the enemies of the revolution, with Turkey, with the Syrian nationalist opposition, and he's blocking the border for humanitarian aid and business. And it seems, in my eyes, that for Barzani, the oil flow to Turkey and his dollars are more important than the liberation of his Kurdish brothers in Rojava. And that's a dangerous attitude, not only for Rojava, but for the unity of the Kurdish people and for Barzani himself. Because if the Kurds in Rojava lose their freedom to Arab nationalists and Al-Qaeda terrorists again, then the Kurds in the south will be the next to lose their game.
Talking about opportunities, Kurds are seeing the Geneva Conference as a chance to solve the Kurdish issue in Syria. What is your perspective on this? What could the Geneva Conference mean to the Kurds, Mr. Browns?
Well, I'm not so optimistic with this Geneva Conference. You know, this conference is organized after the US recognized that they could not get rid of Assad as easily as they wanted, but instead an Al-Qaeda stronghold in Syria was built there. And now, both the US and Russia, they are looking to bring stability back to the region because neither side of their regional allies is able to win. Well, and we still don't know who will join this conference. We don't know which parts of the Syrian opposition will be there. We don't know whether the Kurds will be allowed to join with their own independent delegation, independent from the Syrian Arab opposition. If the Kurds are allowed to join Geneva as such an independent delegation, then they could present themselves as a factor of stability and democratic development in Syria. They could gain international support there. But on the other hand, I don't think that this conference will end the war. At least Al-Qaeda will not be there at the conference. The Islamist groups will not be there. They will go on struggling for their Islamist state, regardless the outcome of this conference. Therefore, if this conference decides to stop delivering weapons to the armed groups in Syria, maybe this could help the Kurds to maintain the control over Rojava. But I don't think that this conference will solve the Kurdish issue. It will end the war.
Mr. Nicholas Browns, the journalist and historian, you've been with us from Berlin. Thank you very much for speaking to Ronahi.
Thank you.
Let's move on now to the following news from Rojava. A committee appointed by KURKCU municipality started their preparations to renovate the border crossing between the Rojava city and Iraq, which was damaged by the fighters of the Islamic State of Iraq and Asham. Afterwards, the border crossing will be ready to transfer humanitarian aid to Rojava. In order to expand the participation of political parties and civic organizations in Rojava administration, the Democratic Society Movement held a meeting in QAMISHLO city with the Syriac Democratic Party, Youth Caucus of Syrian Mother, and Civil Assembly of Christians. The Interim Administration Monitoring Committee of the Democratic Autonomous Administration met in QAMISHLO city with 13 representatives of youth movements. The Malek Association organized a donation ceremony in AFRIN city to collect donations from different organizations that attended the ceremony. Moreover, doctors and personalities who supported the association were honored. In KOBANE City, Women's Initiative organized a musical in KURKCU Culture and Art Center. Maro Adri, a member of the Women's Initiative, stated to Hawar News Agency that organizing this musical was to entertain the citizens of KOBANE City who are living in hard conditions due to the siege imposed on the region. BYD's co-chair Muslim said in an interview with the Jerusalem Post that the United States is seeking to keep the Kurdish issue from being discussed at Geneva. More in the press review. The Guardian wrote about Nelson Mandela and said, Nelson Mandela is a leader above all others. His character and life produced an almost unique mixture of wisdom and innocence. The article went on saying that a distant parallel would be with the Kurdish leader Öcalan, who has maintained a grip on his supporters from his own island prison and is even now negotiating with the Turkish government on something like equal terms. The Global Post described Mandela to the Kurds as the shining light for Turkey's Kurds and added, to the Kurds of Turkey, Nelson Mandela was a source of inspiration for their own struggle, a freedom fighter who was jailed in isolation like their own leader. Jerusalem Post interviewed BYD's co-chair Saleh Muslim and entitled the article with, Behind the Lines, No Solution Without Kurds. According to the Jerusalem Post, BYD's co-chair held out a little hope for the prospect of the upcoming Syrian peace talks in Geneva. Rather, he had a warning for all those who persist in regarding the Syrian war. They are trying to keep the Kurds away from Geneva. We won't accept any decision made at Geneva if we are not involved in it. Right now, we are not invited. The United States is seeking to keep the Kurdish issue from being discussed at Geneva because of the Arab chauvinism. But nobody can force us to obey Geneva decisions. The world and Washington might take note. Al Monitor wrote about Russia's interest in the new Middle East, entitled with the question, Will Russia play the Kurdish card? Russia's connections to the region's Kurdish communities present both opportunities and risks for Moscow's interests in the Middle East. That's all for this week. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.